Porter Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this bill does go some way to redefining or confirming the definitions of the role of the coroner. But I guess in the public's mind, there are kind of three areas of expectation that the public expect from the coroner in conducting an inquest. And I want to concentrate my part one contribution on the role that the coroner has in supporting the expectation of families, because families do have an expectation that a cause of death or the mechanism that where a death has occurred, whether it's as a result of crime or accident or what, is found, so that families are able to then make the necessary steps that they need to take in order to then perform the rituals that they need to for their loved one. There's also an expectation, I guess, if there is if that death is as the result of a crime or part of a criminal investigation, that the coroner's recommendations and report go some way to addressing the issues that might come up in that investigation. And I guess the third area that the public really expect the coroner's input in is really in whether that death is preventable, whether the recommendations that the coroner makes could go some way to ensuring that deaths of this nature don't happen again in the future. So in this regard, I want to really just emphasise the expectations, I guess, of families and loved ones in the role of the coroner. And in particular, I want to talk about how the very, very sensitive topic of how we treat bodies and the body parts and tissues which may be used as part of the investigation to establish the cause of death. And it is a highly sensitive topic, but it is one that the coroners undertake with due care, regardless of whether that death is as a result of a crime or as a result of an accident or an incident that could have been prevented. Because there's no doubt that the treatment of bodies and then what happens in terms of the deceased person after the coroner has made their determination has huge cultural implications. My colleague referred to what would happen to tūpapaku. Well, in my culture we use the same term, and there are specific ways that we would expect our loved ones to be treated through this process. But there are other cultures too that have other sensitivities in the matter of death and the matter of handling deceased persons, which need to be taken into consideration. And in this regard, I refer to the submission that was made by the National Council of Women. It was a very interesting submission, but in reference to Part 1, Subpart 2, Clause 27, where they make a statement about it being vital that processes for retaining or returning human tissue samples should be improved in the sense of being more sensitive to the needs of families. And there should be open discussions between the coroner and the immediate family, so there's clarity and understanding of the processes in place. And this also gives the family time to ask questions and query about the concerns they have with the processes. And I see that as the amended bill was returned to the House, that there has been some consideration made to this, in that the coroner is required to notify the family of retention of any parts of the body, or the right to request or return parts and samples. And it's very clear in this section that the coroner has a role to inform the family about the intention of how they intend to use any parts of the body or any tissue that might be retained once the body is released back to the family. So there is some clear definition, but in terms of what was requested by the submitter and what the understanding is, I guess, of the general public, does it go far enough? And is there an opportunity here to actually to be far more cognizant of the wishes of families over a wide spectrum of culture, Mr. Chair, wide spectrum of cultural backgrounds, to actually be able to have a much more sensitive process, and that's not just about the coroner explaining and saying what they intend to do, but actually taking far more of a steer from the families about what their expectations are of how that body and the tissues will be handled. Because one of the discussions, and it's very sensitive, is that some of the tissue may be destroyed and never be able to be returned to the body, so that the body may not be able to be disposed of and as a completely and whole. And for some cultures, that is a significant issue when it comes to the appropriate conduct and the rituals and the rites of dealing with deceased persons. And it's an important aspect that cannot actually be over-expressed. The coroners and the coronial process has, over time, really taken full cognizance of particularly Māori tikanga when it comes to dealing with bodies, and they've changed their practices in time. And I think here is an opportunity for us to look at other cultural implications. And I refer to also the submission that was made by the Stills family, whose daughter was one of the victims of the tragic Wairarapa balloon crash. And they talked about what happened for them, the anguish of having to wait and not being able to view their, not being able to identify their daughter or to be with her body at the time immediately after the death. So in this case, the coroner didn't actually make any recommendations on reforms for how the process could be improved. But I think it actually suggests to me an opportunity for the family to take a much greater role in determining how we treat our deceased people in this case. It's a very, very sensitive matter, particularly when we're looking at possibly returning the bodies to their families, not in a complete state, and how that might actually impact on families being able to appropriately conduct the rites and rituals of the deceased. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Brett Hudson. The